Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to sharing some of our current labor market information work focused on equity-deserving groups and the results of our barriers research conducted earlier this year. I'll just ask Vicky to go to the next slide. Before introducing my colleague, we'd like to acknowledge that MiHR's office is in Ottawa or Odawa, which is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. The Anishinaabe Algonquin people are the traditional keepers of the land, the Ottawa River and its tributaries, and they continue to nurture this territory. We recognize the importance of acknowledging this authentic history and our relationship, and share this land acknowledgement as part of our effort to build respectful relationships with Indigenous communities and to participate in reconciliation. My name is Leslie Wolcott. I lead MiHR's equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this portion of our presentation today over to Vicky Sobhani, who is a labor market economist here at MiHR, and she's going to give you an overview of our ongoing work focused on equity-deserving groups in the sector. Over to you,
Thank you,
Vicky.
Leslie. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Vicky Sobhani. As Leslie said, I'm an economist in MiHR's labor market information team. So my objective for today is to share the latest diversity trends in Canada's mining labor force and highlight some of the opportunities and gaps that currently exist in this sector. Specifically, I'll be focusing on women, immigrants, and Indigenous peoples in mining today. The findings that I'll be sharing are from a broader report that we are working on that is going to be on EDI in Canada's mining sector that will be published later this year. The report itself is going to be a quantitative analysis on EDI that will include topics such as representation in mining, comparing labor market outcomes such as hours worked, education attainment, and a 10-year projection to understand whether future labor supply of these three groups can sustain growing demands in the future. But for today, I'm going to be specifically focusing on representation. And the key research question that I will be addressing is going to be whether these three groups' representation is comparable when benchmarked against all other industries in Canada's labor force. If not, where and why is mining falling behind? So let's get into it. We'll start with women in mining. So women in mining has been a major topic for over a decade now, and it continues to be an issue. You may have seen this graph before. This shows the share of women in mining contrasted against all other industries. The yellow line is mining industry share of women, and the blue in the background is all industries. And the timeline is from January 2007 to the latest available data in Statistics Canada, that's September 2023. In this context and the next few slides that I'll be talking about, mining industry is defined as including activities that fall under three different subsectors: mining and quarrying, mining support services, and primary metal manufacturing. So women represented about 15% of the mining's workforce in September 2023, compared against an almost equal representation among all other industries. Outside of the seasonal monthly fluctuations that you see here, women's representation has been more or less consistent around 14 to 16% over the last few decades. So in terms of trends, not much improvement there over the past years. Now, the question is, why has this been such a hard needle to move despite the attention and resources that has been devoted to improving representation for women over the past years? If we just look at this graph, on the surface, it kind of looks like a purely mining industry problem, that mining is somehow falling behind while competing against other industries to attract or retain women in the job market. But just looking at this graph alone doesn't really, sorry, I thought someone was talking, but never mind, I'll just continue. Just looking at this graph doesn't give you the full story. So I'll just dig a little bit deeper and look at representation from an occupational lens. Just to orient you to this graph on the left here, the horizontal axis or the x-axis on the scatter graph gives you the share of women in all industries in Canada's overall labor force, versus the vertical or the y-axis is share of women in mining industries labor force. The bubbles you see in the graph represent different jobs. There are about 100 here that MiHR specifically tracks that we consider essential to mining. The different colors of the bubble indicate the category into which each of the jobs are placed. So each of the jobs the 100 jobs you see here are categorized into these unique broad occupational categories. The line in the middle, the diagonal 45-degree line, represents benchmarking against the all industry share of women. So if a job falls above the line, they're overrepresented, versus if they were to be below the line, they're underrepresented. So for the ones that are above, the share of women in the mining industry is higher compared to the benchmark of all industries, and vice versa. So there are 2 points to be made here. First of all, as you can see from the plot, most of the occupations shown here are below the line, which means that most of the jobs are underperforming compared to all other industries. But more importantly, representation of women kind of varies depending on the occupation in question. So each of these dots are in a different spot, meaning that representation is different for each. And a key reason for the overall representation gap is due to this difference in occupational choice. Women make significantly different occupational choices compared to men. Let's take trade occupations, which are the ones in red, as an example. If you look at the bar chart to your right there, that gives you the average of each of these jobs in the broad occupation category. So looking at trade occupations specifically, women in mining represent a 2% share of all trades occupations. And when that is compared against all other industries, that is 4%. What this suggests is that all industries are also underperforming, kind of. 4% share is not a whole lot. What that suggests is that this representation of women, specifically within trades occupation, is a global issue. It's not really a mining specific problem. It's an overall Canadian labor market problem. So that means that mining is losing women far earlier in the job market competition stage. We're actually losing them as early as when they're making occupational choices. So when they're going in and looking at different occupations they could go into, they're not choosing trades. So to contrast this example, we'll look at supervisors, coordinators, and superintendents occupational category. Now, these are your leadership roles, such as department heads, managers, and supervisors. In mining, the share of women in this occupation is 8% compared to a 21% in all other industries. It shows that mining is significantly underperforming compared to other industries. So the problem here is different from the trade occupations, right? Because mining is less able to attract or retain women in leadership compared to other industries, which kind of suggests that there may be some barriers that are in place, specifically in the mining industry, that are unique to the industry, which are preventing women from taking up leadership roles. So what does this really mean in terms of improving representation for women? Well, that kind of depends on the occupation, again, that you're looking at. This graph here, the horizontal axis is the same as before, is the share of women in all industry labor force. But the vertical or the y-axis now is mining share of women's labor force. So I'll give you an example which will maybe make things a bit clearer. Let's look at underground miners as an example. 4% of all underground miners in the Canadian labor force are women. Of that 4%, 82% are already captured by the mining industry. What that means is that the pool of labor force who are women underground miners are already depleting because we have already captured a lot of it. Because the labor pool is small now, improving representation through just competing with other industries is not going to move representation a whole lot. What we would need to do in this case is move this bubble here to the right. That means that we will need to expand the labor pool further so that there is like a larger pool to draw from. In contrast to underground miners, if you look at welders here down below, 5% of all welders are women, but mining has only captured 3% of that 5% labor pool of women who are welders. In this instant, it's different from underground miners because there is now opportunity to improve through competition. The labor market already exists in this case, so improving competitiveness in your company and within the mining industry to kind of attract more women who are welders into mining who are not is going to be an opportunity here that you can utilize. Overall, for each of these occupations, we basically need to understand the universe that they are in and kind of go from there in terms of what strategy would fit them to improve representation. I would also like to draw your attention to the upper right quadrant of this graph here, which is empty. So that means that there are no jobs currently in the market where the share of women in the labor force is high and mining is also drawing a lot from it. That means that the mining share is also high. So there's no role model here. And then ideally, we would like to go to a situation where we see more jobs in the upper right. Moving on now to representation of immigrants in mining. This is actually becoming an increasingly important topic in the recent years, especially since immigrant population is growing at a faster rate now compared to the rest of the population. If you see within the mining industry, share of immigrants represent 13% compared to about a 32% in all other industries. While the trend here is a little bit more positive compared to women, if we were to compare that relative to all other industries, it is relatively flat. But looking at the occupational lens, unlike women in mining, representation is actually underperforming across the board. If you look at the little bubbles that represent job, almost all of them are below the 45-degree line, which means that almost all of them are underperforming when benchmarked against other industries. And then in the bar chart here, you can also see that in all 7 categories, the mining industry is underperforming compared to all other industries. So this indicates that for immigrants, this is a mining industry issue. Immigrants are just not choosing mining in the job market competition stage. They're going into other industries, which means that there are barriers here that are very specific to mining industries that is being overlooked. And then in terms of mining share of immigrant labor market, as you can see here, a lot of the occupations are kind of hugging that mid horizontal axis, including the welders, which means that a lot of these jobs have a fair representation of immigrants in the labor market, but mining industry is just not utilizing them. That means that there are opportunities here to improve utilization or representation for immigrants within these jobs through improvement of better competitiveness. I would specifically like to point out the bubbles in light blue here, which are the professional and physical science jobs. These are your mining engineers and materials engineers. There seems to be a fair bit of immigrant representation in the overall Canadian labor force, but mining is just not tapping the labor force that's already existing there. But in terms of the overall story, that the strategy still differs by occupation, that is still ringing true in terms of immigrants as well. If you look at underground miners, 3% of all underground miners are immigrants, but mining already has 74% of them. So there is a bit of a wiggle room here, but at the same time, expanding the labor force that is moving the bubble to the right is going to be a more effective strategy for improving representation in this case compared to just trying to compete with other industries. Moving over to Indigenous people in mining. So as one of the largest employers of Indigenous peoples, it is not really a surprise that mining kind of continues to outperform other industries in terms of Indigenous representation. The latest September 2023 numbers say that mining industry share of Indigenous is about 10% compared to a 4% in all other industries. And since 2007, where this data first started, Indigenous representation in the mining industry has more than doubled. So that is a favorable outcome in the sector. And then just looking at the occupational lens as well, it looks like the outcome is kind of consistent across all categories as well. In the scatter graph, majority of the jobs are outperforming compared to other industries. Specifically for the jobs in production and technical occupations are far exceeding the benchmark of all other industries. But, of course, that doesn't mean that we're done here. There's certainly room for improvement since the share of it overall is still not very high. It's kind of between 2% to 12%. All representation numbers are still below 20%. And then what this graph shows here is that there are still a few jobs in production, technical, and trade occupations like welders, where even though the indigenous mining industry is doing fairly well compared to other industries, there's still opportunity for improving representation through just more competitiveness. But again, the story is still consistent that there are still jobs like underground miners where you would need to essentially expand the labor pool to improve representation. In this case, 14% of underground miners are Indigenous, and mining already has pretty much a lot of them, about 90%. So just to move the needle a little bit, we need more in this pool to draw from. So before I kind of wrap up my LMI section of this presentation here, I wanted to highlight some common themes that you see within diversity. Overall, that the representation doesn't really give you the full picture if you just look at it from a whole industry perspective, because representation differs based on the occupation and the occupation categories they're in. So it would really vary depending on which job you're talking about. And then some groups, such as women, make significantly different occupational choices compared to their counterparts. So mining may be losing them as early as when they're making occupational choices, and that could be at the secondary or post-secondary level of education. And then lastly, the strategy to move or improve representation differs by the size of the labor pool. In the case of underground miners, we may want to emphasize on labor force development. That would be you're focusing on other things like collaborating with other industries because there's a shared interest to grow the labor pool. And it would involve working together to improve awareness of the sector, increase efforts towards education and training in mining activities, and then just overall shifting the narrative of the mining sector as a whole to reflect a more sustainable future. However, in contrast, in the examples of the welders, a better strategy would be just focusing on competition within. So that means you're improving your recruitment outcomes for mining employers, understanding and removing the systemic barriers that may be in place already that's preventing attraction and retention of diverse workers in the industry overall. That was all from my part. I will pass it over to Leslie now to actually go over some of these barriers that does exist in the mining industry. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Vicky. That's helpful and much appreciated. My objective is to share with you, as Vicky said, the results of our barriers research entitled Integrating EDI, Addressing Systemic Barriers in Canadian Mining. The report will be posted on MiHR's site imminently. It will be available in English and French, and we will share the link with all of our registrants today from today's session when that is posted. On to the next slide. So the barriers research that we completed was carried out in the spring of 2023. It involved two key elements. One was a review of academic and grey literature from relating to mining and related sectors and systemic barriers there. And then we also engaged individual members of the mining workforce in a workforce experiences survey, as well as mining employers in a mining employer survey. And those surveys were focused very much on having staff leads or supports who were focused on EDI, reconciliation, ESG indicators, HR, or other areas of responsibility relevant to EDI. The survey, the results garnered a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. The workforce experiences survey, the links were sent out through various channels, social media, professional networks, including through mining relevant sites where Unifor is involved, relevant to online communities, and through MiHR's prospector newsletter. We had 36 workforce experiences surveys completed and 24 employer surveys completed. On to the next. So the research is conducted in the context in which the mining sector is facing a number of challenges, including high inflation, supply chain issues, increasing demand for critical minerals and metals to support new technologies. And we know that we're working in a context of labor market tightening. And so some of the thinking is that achieving higher employment rates among equity deserving groups will help the Canadian mining sector to address current and expected labor shortages. And we see in some of the work that Vicky shared that there are a number of different approaches may be helpful in terms of alleviating that. And so we're going to talk about that today. On to the next slide, Vicky. Just to reinforce this picture of challenges, in the mining employer survey, respondents indicated a number of challenges that they were addressing, and we can see on this slide the context of challenges that folks who are in EDI or HR related roles are grappling with. These issues really focused very much on supporting candidates with proper training or experience, seeing increased psychological health and safety issues, and ongoing staff turnover. So we'll address some of those today. Next slide. So EDI and mining. So one of some of the thinking is that the sector can broaden its talent pool by advancing equity, valuing diversity, and practicing inclusion. This involves embedding these principles and practices into strategies and operations that also help with workplace culture. But some of the challenges to address and alleviate the systemic barriers that disadvantage equity deserving groups. And so we've included a definition just for clarifying that these systemic barriers are these seemingly neutral systems that serve to disadvantage certain individuals or groups of people, sometimes playing out in terms of workplace experiences and sometimes being compounded or made more complex when people have intersecting experiences or identity factors such as gender and race, for example. On to the next. We'll move on to a discussion of the systemic barriers that showed up through the research. So in terms of the respondents, 86% of the mining employer survey respondents said that employment-related barriers were affecting people in the Canadian mining industry, but only a third of those respondents had experienced inclusion barriers themselves. So it speaks a little bit to some of the leadership pieces that Vicky was talking about, indicating potentially that awareness of employment-related barriers stems largely through indirect means, and the importance of having ongoing organizational training or management professional development on the experiences and the issues facing equity-deserving groups, and also speaking to the potential role for employee resource groups and developing capacity in the sector for engaging diverse groups. So that's a bit of a challenge that we need to look at in terms of having some leadership, helping to support leadership EDI knowledge. The next slide looks at the challenges of lack of available information about the mining sector and related careers. So again, 86% of the mining employer survey respondents said that there was difficulty for people to attract and retain a diverse workforce owing to the lack of available information about the sector. So there can be a number of enhanced efforts to access potential job candidates and diversify the pool through very maybe directed and targeted approaches that help raise awareness of the sector and have not only outreach to secondary and post-secondary schools and students and local communities, but also having some very targeted approaches that serve to organizations that serve equity-deserving groups. Next slide, Vicki. A significant barrier identified, and is the barrier of balancing work and personal life. So in terms of the workforce experiences survey, 68% said that challenges in balancing work with care responsibilities lessens or greatly lessens their attractiveness of employment in mining, and 64% said that challenges in balancing work with personal health needs and also lessens or greatly lessens attractiveness and employment. So we recognize and saw in that earlier slide that there's a challenging context in which we're operating, in that on-site mining operations are located in remote environments and have limited accessibility, often through fly-in, fly-out arrangements. That the structure of work is often coupled with irregular schedules or shifts, and it requires employees needing to be flexible in how they manage the demands of personal life and manage the nature of on-site work. But these amount to systemic barriers for family caregivers and individuals with pre-existing health conditions, for example. The next slide. Another significant barrier identified relates to workplace culture, where we can see sometimes the lacking approaches with respect to equity, diversity, and inclusion can be evident in occurrences of harassment, discrimination, bias, and/or microaggressions. And so mining employees who answered the workplace experiences surveys reported toxic work cultures, with 86% indicating experiencing negative comment, treatment, or actions, or witnessing such behaviors, 68% saying that they witnessed or experienced harassment, and 64% said they witnessed or experienced discrimination. Most of the specific incidents that respondents identified occurred within the last 5 years. And so this is significant, and we know from the broader research that individuals with intersectional identities are more likely to be impacted. On to the next slide. I've included these two slides because this slide and the following slide, because they give a helpful overview of the training completion information that we gathered through the barriers research. So in the workforce experiences survey, respondents said that they identified the training that they completed, with half having completed training on harassment, human rights, individual and systemic discrimination. And that helps to set the tone for a workplace culture that embraces EDI. At the same time, mining employers said that they have, over 70% said that they have training programs in place to address harassment, and that training that's focused on Indigenous awareness and inclusion, truth and reconciliation, as well as gender diversity and inclusion were available through just over half of the employers that completed the survey. So this suggests that maybe there's more that can be done to help raise this awareness through training in terms of creating some baselines of awareness in the sector. On to the next slide. This slide also, the barriers research undertook to ask respondents to provide demographic data for themselves as respondents, but also we asked the employers to indicate what data they're currently collecting. And so we see here that there's a preponderance or a focus on gender identity and Indigenous identity, with more, a selection of employers focusing on age-related data. And so there's room, maybe opportunity for additional work here, and also developing capacity for potentially developing capacity for helping to ensure that that's done in a manner that supports confidentiality and anonymity, and building that trust. You can see how that may link also to elements of workplace culture, where you're wanting to build trust, so that the collection of that, facilitating the collection of that data. On to solutions and recommendations. So the integration of EDI into company strategies, policies, practices training, culture, and evaluation is critical in terms of ensuring that goals and objectives are met, whether they're qualitative or quantitative in nature. And action plans are helpful in terms of integrating EDI into all areas of talent management and workplace culture. On to the next piece. So these slides will point to some of the solution and possible actions. So under enhancing leadership commitment, we see the possibility to align with corporate commitment and core values for developing strategy, for having a commitment statement and or code of conduct regarding EDI and or reconciliation, and integrating these approaches into key functional activities. What's interesting is that there are a number of drivers here, some related to ESG performance and monitoring, some driven by impact benefit agreements and other economic and community development agreements, alignment with core values, investor pressure. It's significantly drivers in terms of business performance, effectiveness, and continuity, with research indicating that creativity, innovation, and problem solving are enhanced through integration of EDI into processes and policies, and that's then also having supporting and protecting corporate brand and reputation as another driver around leadership commitment. Moving over to the next slide. Another possible solution is having policies and programs in place that address some of the elements we identified as issue areas, such as having anti-harassment or discrimination approaches, having EDI-related policies, mechanisms, robust mechanisms for reporting harassment and protecting against reprisals, integrating EDI into goal setting and performance management, as well as into ESG. Now, I'll note that this slide talks about HR policies. They don't necessarily need to be housed there, and in fact, it's very interesting in the sector, as there's consideration around locating EDI related objectives and thinking strategically about whether that's going to be focused in a particular area or across a number of areas, such as ESG or health and safety or innovation or human resources or other areas appropriate to your organizational context. Next slide. So we've seen some of what Vicky spoke about in terms of working through some of the talent attraction elements in terms of attracting and recruiting a more diverse workforce. So some of the drivers here are about not only strengthening but expanding that mining labor force, maintaining community relations, such as with Indigenous communities, and having the labor pool that the sector needs. So this can be carried out a number of ways, and we've identified a few here on this slide, including inclusive language, processes for requesting and supporting workplace accommodations, ensuring equity in benefits and compensation. Next slide. So on the talent retention side of things, there are a number of important potential actions. We mentioned training already, there are structures in terms of not just staff committees and employee resource groups, but also how you structure responsibility for EDI, as I mentioned, in your corporate organization, and how that's supported in terms of programs and training and linking to capacity development and professional training. Some of what we've looked at is, given what Vicky has said about the leadership at that supervisory level, what's the training capacity support need there? And drawing on the concerns around psychological health and safety, having more mental health supports and employee wellness initiatives can also be helpful. Lastly, we'll turn to the importance of inclusive workplace culture, centering on valuing diversity and achieving equity. It's important, as I mentioned, to create that culture of trust, enabling disclosure and reporting, supporting a positive reporting culture where we're dealing with where there may be harassment issues at play. That the design of these elements can be informed and integrated into EDI strategies and action plans, supported by training and capacity building. That also is integrated into performance management. So, and we can see some of these signs of workplace culture evident in inclusive language, harassment, reporting data, equitable compensation and benefits, feeling safe to report psychological health and safety concerns, as well as physical health and safety concerns, and the range of workplace accommodations that could be available. Lastly, just turning over to the importance of monitoring and evaluation. The report speaks to the importance of tracking and analyzing the results of EDI efforts, and undertaking a cycle of continuous improvement. We can see that best practices are best shared, and so we encourage that also within the sector. And so these elements of reporting and sharing on some of the annual objectives that people have, or some of the effective practices that people have in terms of organizations have in terms of meeting their goals around representation and inclusion, can also be helpful. And I think that just leads us to the piece about questions. So we do have a few minutes to respond to questions. Does anybody maybe raise your hand if you have a question? Or feed it through the chat. You can also do that. No questions for this time? We have one that's come up about mentioning that isolation is a barrier for equity deserving groups. Can we speak more about what isolation looks like and what mining companies can do to address it? I would say that many individuals from equity deserving groups experience feelings of isolation and of being excluded from peers and peer groups in the workplace. It's very much the opposite of inclusion. which is described in the report as the feeling of belonging in your organization and team, feeling treated with dignity as an individual, and feeling encouraged to fully participate and bring your uniqueness to work every day. And EDI offers a means of counteracting some of those feelings of isolation and building on connection in the workplace through some of that awareness raising that can help facilitate connection, belonging, and cohesion in the workplace.
There are a few questions that came up in the chat, Leslie. The first one, do you have any suggestions to help land a job in the industry?
I would suggest you look at our Mining Needs You website that will point you to career profiles and so on in the sector. And then I would suggest identifying and reaching out to individual companies and their websites based on the area or areas that you're looking at.
Next question, are we able to get a copy of the presentation today?
I think what we're going to do is we'll put the copy of this, we've recorded this session, and we'll put a copy of that up on MiHR's YouTube channel. And as I mentioned, we'll probably include a link to this as we mail the link out to the Barriers Research Report to you.
Next question, with immigration levels holding, how can we grow immigrant participation?
That's a really good question. I have some thoughts on that. Vicky, do you have any thoughts on that based on what your labor market analysis is saying?
Yeah, on the labor market side, the thing that kind of jumps out at us is the population of immigrants and where they're concentrated. If you kind of think about it intuitively too, most of the immigrants coming into Canada are sort of based either in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, right? The bigger populous cities, but mining jobs are not in those cities, right? That's kind of the first issue. When immigrants are coming into Canada, they are not even aware of these jobs because they don't see it around. So in terms of how do we grow participation, a lot of it has to do with awareness. Like mining is not top of mind for immigrants when they come in. So just, having that awareness in there when they're coming in, whatever stage of their career they're in, whether it's, as students or as, workers, just having that awareness is going to be very, very helpful. This is something we're going to explore more on our report as well. So I encourage you to read that as well when it comes out. Anything to add there, Leslie?
I would add that MiHR is actually undertaking some research now to understand the landscape. We're doing an analysis of federal and provincial programs and resources to support to help support the integration of newcomers and immigrants into the sector. We've connected with, I see in the chat, there's a question about on this vein of having submitted a number of applications and so on. So just in the past week or so, we've been interfacing with a settlement service organization, and we're going to look at it kind of a case of 2 or 3 or 4 individuals who may be in a similar situation to the individual raising this question here, just kind of trying to analyze what's going on and understand the barriers a little bit further. So we're committed to doing more work in this area, understanding the importance of this. I would suggest that folks who find themselves in this situation continue to watch our online networks that we're developing around around careers in particular, and the work that we're doing on integrating newcomers, because that we hope to be able to help address some of those concerns.
Next question. Do you have the immigrant and Indigenous data broken down by gender? We do, but I don't think that's going to be the focus of the report that's about to come out. But if you have questions around that specifically, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can certainly look into that more for you. Next question, is refugee part of immigrants or a separate sector? We use Statistics Canada's definition of immigrants, at least on the LMI side of things. And Statistics Canada's definition of immigrants is anyone who is not born in Canada. So that would include refugees, yes. Next question, what can mining companies, sorry, go ahead.
Can I just add there, Vicky, that sometimes people will hear us referring also to newcomers. So we'll refer to newcomers and we'll refer to immigrants. And so in the discussion, newcomers are referred to when we're talking, we're referring to people who have immigrated within the last 5 years, and including that as newcomers, because there are, different needs. Maybe there are different needs across the immigrating experience, but certainly there are a unique set there in terms of within those first 5 years.
Definitely. Next question, what can mining companies do to address the negative perception of the mining industry from younger generations and or to increase students in mining related careers?
MiHR is doing a lot of work in that area. And so I encourage you to continue to watch our work in that area. We have just released mining and looking at PSE, post-secondary education. That report is on our website, and we're working to try to address those perceptions. We often find that it's we have our career ambassador program. We're shortly launching curriculum that aims at helping grades 7 to 10 understand the changing dynamic of mining and mining processes and how it relates to a clean economy, the transition to a clean economy. And so we're working very much to support that. And if you have further thoughts on that and or want to get involved, we encourage you to reach out to us at MiHR on that.
Okay, I think you addressed this one already, Leslie, about as an internationally trained geologist, submitted a lot of job applications, but nothing's come through. Is there any recommendation for networking? Will MiHR hold mining job fair or career training for job seekers?
There is a career fair. MiHR regularly holds career fairs and is involved in career fairs. And so I believe that there's one upcoming later in November. Any other questions? Have we covered those?
These are the ones that were in the chat. I think I've covered everything. There's one more. Could you speak to best practices with regards to companies retaining, not just recruiting talent?
I think that when it comes to EDI and retaining talent, there are so many effective practices, and MiHR is working on the development of a toolkit of resources that will help mining companies implement the new EDI protocol towards sustainable mining. And those will be built around effective practices and are coming soon. So it's a host of looking at a number of processes, such as having a corporate commitment or policy statement, having a strategy or action plan that's evaluable and monitored. It includes offering things like training as a baseline, to have a baseline of awareness, but also of expectation amongst employees, so that they're aware of requirements with regard to, for example, inclusion, harassment, and so on. We soon will be having some policy exemplars with regard to sexual harassment and related procedures, as well as a guideline for addressing domestic abuse, domestic violence, and intimate partner violence in the workplace. And so we're excited to be sharing those out soon. Those are some examples of things.
I think we have time for last question. Do you think the TSM protocol will help accelerate EDI?
I do. I'm very excited about it. And I have to say, you know, I'm relatively new to the mining sector, but have been doing work in the EDI area for, I don't know, 25 to 30 years. And so I think that the TSM protocols set out those factors, those criteria that are really effective practices for helping to integrate into an organization and across a workplace. It's not a single lever. It requires a real systemic approach. It's challenging because, you know, we're addressing issues that are societal issues. They take a certain look and have a certain pattern in the mining sector, and they have a certain pattern within a particular organization. But we are trying to address really societal issues. So it's challenging. It can be challenging, but important. On that note, I think if that's all the questions for the day, we'll thank everyone so much for your time today and for your great questions. And as I said, we'll post this presentation, as well as send out links to the Barriers Research Report. Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thanks for joining.